Sometimes the sky becomes the scene of tragedies that remind us that even the most advanced technology is powerless in the face of human error and a chain of coincidences. Today, we will look back at 6 major plane crashes that changed the rules of flight and are forever etched in the history of global aviation. First place goes to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. This date forever changed not only aviation, but the entire world. In the morning hours of September 11, 2001, terrorists carried out a carefully planned series of attacks using hijacked passenger planes. 2 airliners were flown into the towers of the World Trade Center in New York, causing them to collapse. A 3rd aircraft struck the Pentagon building in Arlington, and a 4th aircraft, suffering serious damage and facing resistance from passengers, crashed in Pennsylvania, likely preventing even greater destruction. These attacks killed nearly 3,000 people, and each life lost was a tragedy for family, friends, and communities around the world. The shock of what was seen on television screens and in the press instantly filled the information space. The collapse of symbols of economic power, the attack on a military center, and the heroism of people trying to resist the terrorists formed a new image of threats and led to a total reassessment of risks. In the aviation industry, the consequences were unprecedented. Security rules underwent radical changes, passenger and baggage screening procedures became much stricter, reinforced doors were installed at the entrances to cockpits, and access to the cockpit was strictly limited and regulated. Airports around the world tightened controls, upgraded equipment for scanning and checking hand luggage, introduced new protocols for checking cargo and delivering baggage, and developed more coordinated procedures for information exchange between airlines, border control, and special services. Government agencies and international organizations responded by creating new services and reforms aimed at combating terrorism and protecting civilian infrastructure. Security laws were revised, closer cooperation between intelligence agencies was established, and the aviation industry received additional regulations and recommendations on preventing hijackings and managing emergencies. It is important to emphasize that the changes affected not only technology and formal procedures, but also the human factor. Crew training began to include scenarios for countering hijacking and interacting with security agencies. Airport staff underwent new courses on identifying suspicious behavior, and the security culture became more proactive and multi-layered. In addition to technical and organizational measures, society was faced with a long reflection on the nature of terrorism, the motives of the attackers, and methods of preventing radicalization. Issues of international law, state responsibility, and the need for a comprehensive approach combining law enforcement with political and social programs came to the fore. The tragedy of September 11th also deeply affected those who were at the scene. Rescue workers, firefighters, law enforcement officers, and medics showed unparalleled courage, risking their lives to help the victims, and many of them later faced long-term health consequences, which was another aspect of the overall cost of those events. For the relatives of those who died, a difficult journey of mourning and seeking justice began. Numerous court cases, international investigations, and questions about compensation served as a reminder that legal and political consequences cannot heal personal losses. In cultural and psychological terms, this day has had a lasting impact. Memorials, commemorative events, books, and films keep the memory of those who died alive, while discussions about freedom, security, and privacy resurface time and again in the public sphere. In aviation practice, the lessons of September 11th have been reflected in a new security philosophy. From technical barriers to personnel selection and training processes, everything must be designed to prevent a repeat of the tragedy and to minimize the consequences if a threat does arise. Programs for sharing intelligence and recommendations for air carriers regarding routes and risk assessment have been introduced, as well as enhanced screening of personnel with access to critical areas of airports and aircraft. The changes have also affected passengers. Rules of conduct on board, information about evacuation procedures, and interaction with the crew became part of the new reality of flying. Finally, the international community learned broader lessons. The attacks had serious consequences in international politics, led to military and diplomatic initiatives, and sparked debates about the balance between security and civil liberties. Despite all the measures and reforms that have been implemented, the memory of the victims remains the main focus. Annual commemorations, memorial complexes, and personal stories preserve the humanitarian center of this tragedy, reminding us that behind all the changes and new practices are people and their losses. This day has gone down in history as a point of no return, after which the world began to view threats in the air and measures to prevent them differently, and the lessons of September 11th continue to shape approaches to security, law, and international cooperation to this day. Second place goes to the Tenerife collision in 1977. On March 27, 1977, a tragedy occurred at Los Rodeos Airport in the Canary Islands that could have been avoided and left a deep mark on aviation history and people's memories. Due to fog, limited visibility, and a series of unfortunate circumstances, two aircraft, both Boeing 747s, one belonging to KLM and one to Pan Am, found themselves on the runway at the same time, where a misunderstanding in radio communications and a premature takeoff led to a terrible collision. The explosion and fire instantly destroyed both aircraft, and the death toll was horrific. 583 people, including passengers and crew members, were killed, and the lives of many families and communities were destroyed. On that day, a combination of unexpected factors, from external conditions to human error, led to a tragic chain of events. The investigation revealed that not only fog and limited visibility played a key role, but also ambiguous radio communications, differences in procedures and communication culture between crews and air traffic controllers, crew fatigue, and the emotional stress associated with delays and the need to make operational decisions in a stressful environment. It was after this disaster that the global aviation community began to seriously review its approaches to radio communication, cockpit interaction, and the regulation of airport procedures in low visibility conditions. The introduction of clear, standardized phraseology requiring mandatory confirmations and unambiguous wording was one of the main practical consequences aimed at eliminating the risk of misinterpretation of commands and instructions. In addition, changes were made to runway safety organization, requirements for crew and air traffic controller training were strengthened, and programs were launched to practice scenarios in conditions of limited visibility and increased stress. Great importance was placed on teamwork, the ability to argue and correct decisions in the cockpit environment regardless of rank, and a safety culture that encourages open communication about mistakes and doubts without fear of punishment. The legal and social consequences of the collision were long and complex. Court proceedings, compensation claims, questions of airline and government responsibility, and the need to provide psychological and material assistance to the families of the victims. For many relatives and loved ones, the loss was the beginning of a long journey of grief, the fight for justice, and the search for answers, which often came at a heavy price. International aviation organizations and national regulators began to coordinate their actions more actively, exchange information, and implement common standards to prevent similar accidents from happening again. This incident became one of the mandatory examples for analysis in pilot and air traffic controller training programs. Scenarios involving limited visibility, non-standard situations on the runway, and communication errors began to be practiced on simulators. There was also an increased focus on the human factor. Issues such as crew fatigue, task allocation, stress management, and decision-making in uncertain situations became the subject of professional programs and research. Memorials and commemorative events held annually remind us of those who died and that every life is precious. The Tenerife tragedy was an important lesson for aviation and society as a whole. It showed that safety is a system that requires attention to detail, coordinated procedures, and constant work to improve communication between people and machines. Many industry changes that followed the disaster saved lives and reduced the likelihood of similar mistakes being repeated. But for the victims' relatives, no reforms could bring back their lost loved ones. At the same time, the accident stimulated research into human factors, collision avoidance technologies, and improved ground traffic management methods, which subsequently increased the overall resilience of aviation systems. The emphasis on training, standardization of communication, and strengthening of safety culture became one of the main legacies of this tragic event. The international cooperation that developed after the disaster led to the creation of joint programs for the exchange of experience and best practices, as well as the introduction of technological solutions to facilitate mutual understanding in the cockpit and the coordination of actions at the airport. Despite all the changes, the memory of those days remains alive. The stories of passengers and crews, letters and memories of relatives, community leaders and volunteers maintain a living connection with the past and pass on lessons to new generations of professionals. The importance of this lesson lies in the realization that even with advanced technology and strict procedures in place, human error, misunderstanding, or fatigue can lead to catastrophic consequences if not addressed systematically and preventively. These memories become a commitment. Every aviation rule, every standard, and every training exercise is the result of past losses and mistakes that must not be forgotten. Third place, Japan Airlines Flight 123, 1985. On August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123, a Boeing 747, took off from Tokyo and, shortly after takeoff, encountered the devastating consequences of an old repair. 12 minutes after takeoff, the rear fuselage compartment suddenly depressurized when the damaged section of the skin failed under pressure. The explosive release of air and the rupture of the structure led to the separation of the tail section of the aircraft, damage to the control systems, and a rapid loss of aerodynamic stability. The pilots found themselves in an incredibly difficult situation. Most of the traditional controls were out of order, and the information from the onboard instruments was incomplete and contradictory. In such conditions, the crew fought courageously to regain control of the aircraft and attempted to restore control using the remaining thrust and maneuvering capabilities to steer the airliner towards a possible landing site. The flight continued for about 30 minutes of tense and heroic confrontation between people and a damaged machine, during which the crew did everything possible to find a safe landing spot and minimize the consequences of the accident. In the end, the airliner crashed into a mountain range, and all passengers and crew members, a total of 520 people, were killed in the tragedy, making it the largest single aircraft disaster in history. The investigation determined that the immediate cause of the destruction was a defect in the tail section resulting from improper repair of the aircraft fuselage after a previous incident, and that systemic failures in documentation and quality control contributed to the accumulation of risk. This case highlighted an important problem: how operational pressures, time constraints, and economic considerations can lead to a decline in repair and inspection standards, and thus to a threat to the lives of passengers. After the tragedy, Japanese and global aviation authorities radically revised the rules for maintenance and quality control of repair work, tightened inspections, requirements for workshop certification, and mandatory documentation of all operations. Stricter standards for documenting repairs, quality control of welding and restoration work, mandatory rechecking of critical components, and multi-stage safety confirmation after repairs were introduced, as well as increased oversight by regulators and the creation of external audit procedures. These changes affected not only airlines and repair workshops, but also the manufacturing sector, component suppliers, and certification bodies, leading to greater transparency of processes and increased accountability of contractors. In addition to technical adjustments, there were also changes in safety culture. The emphasis shifted towards transparency, information sharing, and encouraging reports of identified defects without fear of punishment, which made it possible to identify and eliminate problems at an early stage. The investigation and subsequent court proceedings revealed systemic deficiencies, including fragmented damage data, a lack of centralized repair history records, and shortcomings in quality control, which led to major reforms in documentation and parts records. For the relatives of the victims, a long and difficult journey began in search of justice, compensation, and moral restoration, accompanied by litigation, public attention, and official investigations. While for Japanese society, the incident became a painful lesson on a national scale. In aviation and engineering circles, the crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123 became a symbol of the need to adhere to the strictest standards, a reminder that even relatively long-standing defects and negligence in repairs can lead to irreparable losses. In flight schools and on simulators, this incident has been included in training programs as a cautionary example, used to practice scenarios of partial loss of control, thrust control, and the use of non-standard techniques to stabilize the aircraft. Many experts emphasize that the human factor remains key. A trained and focused crew can mitigate the consequences of failures if they have clear procedures, support, and time to make decisions, as well as accurate information about the condition of the aircraft. Another important lesson was that control over repairs and maintenance cannot be subject solely to commercial interests. Safety must be a priority, and inspections must be independent and comprehensive. After the tragedy, aid and support funds were set up for the families of the victims. Commemorative events were held, memorials were erected, public initiatives were organized in memory of the victims, and psychological assistance and legal support programs were launched. This tragedy is remembered not only as numbers and reports, but also as human stories about lost lives, destinies, and families whose lives were changed forever. As a result of the changes made, the aviation industry has become more attentive to aircraft repair history, damage data collection, and mandatory reporting on all operations, as well as to the continuous improvement of non-destructive testing methods and monitoring of vulnerable areas of the fuselage. Over time, many countries introduced additional regulations requiring periodic inspections of particularly vulnerable areas and the involvement of independent experts for complex repairs, which improved aircraft reliability. For engineers and technicians, this served as a reminder that even a small error in calculations or execution can have catastrophic consequences, and that quality standards must be adhered to without compromise. Culturally, the incident left a deep mark. Books, studies, and documentaries recreate the events of that August and tell the stories of the passengers, crew, and rescuers. While the memory of the victims is kept alive by relatives, volunteers, and communities who organize meetings and initiatives to improve aviation safety. The disaster also stimulated the development of aircraft structure monitoring technologies, non-destructive testing methods, and systems for recording the operational history of parts, which has reduced the risk of similar defects recurring and increased the overall resilience of the fleet. Ultimately, the lesson is simple. Safety requires strict adherence to procedures, quality control, and transparency. This story serves as a reminder of the human cost of negligence and encourages us to work to prevent similar disasters and preserve their memory. Fourth place, Flight MH17, Ukraine, 2014. On July 17, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17, a Boeing 777, was operating a scheduled flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. Over an area where armed hostilities and conflict were taking place at the time, the airliner was hit by a missile from an anti-aircraft system, causing it to disintegrate instantly in the air. All passengers and crew members were killed. There were no survivors on board, a total of 298 people. This disaster instantly went beyond the scope of an ordinary aviation accident and turned into an international political and human shock, because the plane crashed over the conflict zone, involving not only the families of the victims in the tragedy, but also states, international institutions, and the entire world community. The investigation, which lasted months and years, brought together investigative teams from different countries, international experts, and civil aviation authorities. Its aim was to establish the causes and circumstances of the incident and to find those responsible for the loss of life. The results of the investigation and the conclusions reached gave rise to serious international debate, profound political consequences, and legal proceedings that dragged on for many years and concerned issues of air safety over conflict zones, the responsibility of the parties involved, and the punishment of those guilty. After the tragedy, the practice of flying civil air corridors near combat zones was called into question, and a number of airlines revised their routes, introducing stricter restrictions and avoiding flights over dangerous areas. This disaster became a symbol of how modern armed conflicts can directly threaten civil aviation and how the consequences of such conflicts extend far beyond local confrontations. Public discourse widely discussed issues of compensation for the families of the victims, international legal responsibility, and measures to prevent such tragedies from happening again. For the relatives of the lost passengers and crew members, a long journey of grief, legal battles, and waiting for justice began, accompanied by a multitude of emotions, official statements, and appeals to international organizations. At the same time, the aviation industry was faced with the need to develop new risk standards and route assessments, as well as increased attention to information about ground threats and the ability to monitor them. Many experts emphasize that flight safety requires not only technical perfection of aircraft and crew training, but also political cooperation, intelligence sharing, and timely warnings of possible threats in the airspace. The memory of the victims is preserved in testimonies, memorials, and publications. The tragedy of Flight MH17 became a turning point for changes in international practice related to the protection of civil aviation. At the political level, the incident heightened tensions between states and gave rise to new requirements for the investigation of incidents involving civil aircraft, resulting in stricter controls on flights over conflict regions. Over time, international initiatives have emerged to increase the transparency of investigations and the exchange of information between countries, with the aim of reducing the risk of similar disasters and ensuring a more coordinated response in the event of an emergency. However, for many families and loved ones of those who died, no international agreements or court decisions could replace their loss and grief, and this incredible human cost became a constant reminder of the fragility of peaceful life and the threats posed by conflicts, even when they unfold on the ground. Ultimately, the tragedy of Flight MH17 became not only the subject of investigations and political debate, but also a cultural event of remembrance, reflected in books, documents, memorial events, and in the public consciousness of those countries whose citizens were on board. This case taught the international community important lessons: the need for a more cautious approach to air corridors over conflict zones, the need for international cooperation in the exchange of information on threats, and the importance of clear procedures in responding to such incidents. It is no exaggeration to say that the consequences of this tragedy are still being felt today, as issues of security, responsibility, and truth continue to be the focus of attention for both experts and the general public. The investigation materials, reports, and international resolutions related to this incident were analyzed at length in various countries, and their publication was accompanied by political disputes and public resonance. Funds were set up to help the families of the victims. Public initiatives were launched to preserve the memory of those who died and support the victims, and numerous initiatives were taken to improve air transport safety procedures and airspace monitoring. Many researchers and analysts drew attention to the need to develop technologies for early detection of threats and to warn airlines about the risks associated with flying over combat zones. In civil aviation safety training materials, this incident is often cited as an example of how geopolitical factors can affect flight safety. Fifth place goes to the Lockerbie tragedy of 1988. On December 21, 1988, an explosion occurred on board a passenger aircraft belonging to the well-known American airline Pan Am over the Scottish town of Lockerbie. The explosion destroyed the Boeing 747, which was flying from London to New York, and killed 259 passengers and crew members, as well as 11 civilians on the ground. This act of violence became one of the most notorious terrorist attacks on civil aviation in the late 20th century, and has long been remembered by societies around the world as a symbol of the fragility of safety in the skies. The investigation into the disaster, which lasted months and years, revealed that an explosive device, carefully concealed and planted by terrorists, had been detonated on board. The search for evidence, the collection of fragments and forensic analysis required the coordination of many services: Scottish investigators, experts from the United States and other countries, as well as hundreds of specialists working on the ground. The reconstruction of the wreckage and analysis made it possible to recreate the course of events and partially explain how the bomb could have been brought on board. But many questions remained the subject of lengthy legal disputes and diplomatic negotiations. The case gained international attention. Not only were criminal charges on the agenda, but also the responsibility of states, the need to exchange intelligence and reform international security procedures. The practical consequences of the tragedy were profound and far-reaching. Baggage and cargo acceptance rules were revised and tightened, shipment tracking procedures and new processing standards were introduced, and transfer operations were subject to more rigorous checks. Airlines began to pay closer attention to supply chains, especially in-flight catering and related cargo, and airports around the world introduced stricter requirements for the labeling, sealing, and control of cargo units. Technological advances, driven by the need to prevent similar tragedies, have led to the introduction of more sensitive methods for detecting traces of explosives, the development of X-ray systems and detectors, and the standardization of procedures for interaction between security services in different countries. Many families of the victims joined together in associations and social movements, demanding justice and support. Their struggle led to lengthy legal proceedings and became an important part of the public dialogue on the prevention of terrorism. The cultural response was also significant. Journalistic investigations, documentaries, and books attempted to record the events and preserve the memory of those who lost their lives in the disaster. Memorials and commemorative sites appeared in Lockerbie, and annual commemorations became moments of public solidarity and a reminder of the price of mistakes and omissions in the security system. The investigation required cooperation between countries, forensic scientists, and explosives experts. Recovering the wreckage and analyzing the evidence became a complex technical task. The families of the victims joined forces to demand transparency and justice, which led to court cases and diplomatic negotiations. The practical consequences of Lockerbie were reflected in stricter rules for accepting and checking in baggage, the introduction of shipment tracking, and improvements in explosives detection technology. Airlines reviewed their supply chains and tightened controls over in-flight catering and cargo, while airports improved staff training and information sharing with security forces. On a technical level, more sensitive detectors and modern X-ray systems appeared, as well as standards aimed at preventing dangerous items from being brought on board. Culturally, the tragedy gave rise to documentary investigations, publications, and commemorative initiatives. Memorials and annual remembrance ceremonies preserve the memory of the victims. Lockerbie became a painful lesson in the need for constant vigilance. It ranks fifth on our list not only in terms of the number of fatalities, but also in terms of the scale of changes it brought about in international aviation security. Many of the reforms of those years are still in place today, serving as a reminder of the cost of mistakes and the importance of cooperation. Sixth place, the crash of Air France Flight 447 in 2009. On May 31, 2009, Air France Flight 447 was flying from Rio de Janeiro to Paris aboard an Airbus A330. During the night, the aircraft crossed the equatorial latitudes of the Atlantic Ocean and encountered severe turbulence and thunderclouds. As a result of icing, the pitot tube's speed sensors necessary for the correct operation of the autopilot and control systems froze. The autopilot shut down, and the pilots received conflicting and fluctuating instrument readings. Flying at night over the endless ocean with thick clouds and no visual landmarks, the crew found themselves in a critical situation. The inaccurate speed data misled them, and at some point, the aircraft went from stable flight to a dangerous mode. The pilots in the cockpit attempted to restore normal control, but events unfolded extremely quickly. The aircraft entered a steady descent and then a spin. Shortly thereafter, the airliner crashed into the ocean, killing all 228 people on board, including passengers and crew. The location of the wreckage remained unknown for a long time. The search was complicated by the vast area of the possible crash site, difficult weather conditions, and the considerable depth of the seabed. It was only after about 2 years that large fragments of the fuselage and flight recorders were found at a depth of almost 4 kilometers. Their recovery was made possible by the use of deep-sea technology and international cooperation. The decryption of the recordings provided the key to understanding the dramatic sequence of events in the cockpit. The investigation, conducted by French and international experts, concluded that the disaster was caused by a combination of technical and human factors. The freezing of the speed sensors caused the automatic systems to shut down and led to conflicting readings. As a result, the crew found themselves in a situation requiring quick decisions to be made with limited information. Analysis of cockpit conversations and parametric data showed that the pilots failed to restore the aircraft's normal aerodynamic configuration in a timely and consistent manner, which led to a loss of control. In addition to purely technical conclusions, the investigation revealed important issues regarding crew training and procedures for interacting with automation systems. It was noted that rare but critical failures require special training on simulators, practicing actions in the event of a loss of reliable readings, and practicing maneuvers to recover from a stall at night. Experts recommended strengthening training in manual control in the event of indicator failure, improving communication and role distribution in the cockpit, and reviewing protocols for transitioning from automatic to manual piloting. Technical and regulatory consequences followed fairly quickly. Manufacturers and airlines revised requirements for critical sensors, modernized and mass-replaced vulnerable components, improved signal processing and filtering algorithms, and revised the logic for disengaging the autopilot in the event of a loss of trusted data. Regulators and the professional community emphasized the need to integrate the lessons learned into training programs and safety standards. In addition to professional changes, the crash of Air France Flight 447 left a deep mark on the public consciousness and on the lives of the families of the victims. Lengthy investigations, court proceedings, and questions of liability accompanied this tragedy for many years. For the aviation industry, The incident served as a stark reminder that automation does not eliminate the role of the human factor, and that crew training must constantly adapt to new technological and weather challenges. This case has taken center stage in the aviation community's memory as an example of the combination of technological vulnerabilities and the critical importance of emergency response training. The measures taken after the investigation. In training, sensor design and regulations have become part of the legacy of the tragedy and are aimed at reducing the risk of similar events recurring. Many of the investigation's conclusions remain relevant today. Each of these disasters is a reminder of the price of mistakes, ambition, and chance. After each tragedy, humanity took a step towards greater safety, but the sky still holds the memory of those who did not make it. The sky does not forgive carelessness, but every lesson paid for with lives makes new flights safer.